get going. Liz, are you going to be sharing slides or just a handout?
I'm just doing the handout thing. I don't think
Okay.
I'll share my screen. I'll just let people follow along on their own screens if that's okay.
Cool.
So I put the handout in the chat. Maybe someone could just click on it and tell me they can access it. I don't think there would be any. Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
So.
Well, let's go ahead and start here. Welcome to the 235 session of the Princeton Phil Religion Incubator. Our speaker in this session is Liz Jackson, who is an assistant professor at Ryerson. Ryerson, did I pronounce that correctly? Ryerson University. We're so glad to have her. Basically, we're going to run presentation for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then 30 to 35 minutes of Q&A after that. I'll be running the queue to get in the queue. You're just going to use the raise hand function, and we'll talk about all that when we get there. So without further ado, Liz, take us away.
Awesome. I'm going to paste the handout just one more time in case anyone came in late. And then if more people trickle in, maybe Jeff, you could just repaste it in there in case people need the link. So I just wanted to start off by saying, first of all, thanks so much to the conference organizers. This has been super awesome. I think I mentioned yesterday, it's like the perfect length of time for presentations for my attention span. So it's just been great and some amazing talks, some really, really good talks. So Daniel, Andrew, everyone else who organized, thank you. Jeff, thank you for chairing. I also wanted to say that Jeff and I go way back. We were grad school buddies, so it's fun to run into you again. And thanks to everyone for coming as well. So yeah, like I said, there's a handout in the chat. I'm not going to share my screen, so you can just kind of follow along with the handout. Okay, so I want to start off with sort of 3 questions you might ask about philosophy of religion. The first is what you might call the ontology of theism. Does God exist? Then there's the epistemology of theism. Should we believe in God, or is it rational to believe in God? And then there's finally the axiology of theism. Should we want God to exist, or would it be a good thing for God to exist? And this talk is going to be focusing on that third question. I wanted to kind of open it this way because I think it's actually really interesting to think about these 3 together, because you can actually mix and match some of these views. You could, for example, say, I'm an atheist, I don't think that God exists, but I think it's reasonable to believe in God, and I think we should want God to exist. Or you could be a theist, but say it's not reasonable to believe in God, but we should want God to exist, for example. So it's kind of cool. You can sort of mix and match these 3 issues together. And I think a lot of attention has been paid to sort of the ontology and epistemology question, and maybe less to the axiology question, although some has been paid recently to it. But it's a much smaller literature than I think the first 2. Okay, so as a basic overview of sort of the 2 main positions in the axiology of theism literature, there's what you might call pro-theism and then what you might call anti-theism. So pro-theists in general say that God's existence would be a good thing. For example, if God exists, this ensures that there's ultimate cosmic justice, human lives are meaningful, no evil is gratuitous, etc., etc. I think you kind of get the idea. And then there's anti-theists who argue that God's existence would be a bad thing, because if God exists, this invades our privacy. It maybe renders morality incoherent for like divine command theory reasons, potentially. Some lives are meaningless and absurd, especially lives of people that maybe aren't theists, for instance. So these are some of the considerations that are often used to motivate anti-theism. Note that these 2 options aren't exhaustive. You could take other views in the axiology of theism as well. So you could say the world is equally good on theism or on atheism. You could say like the relevant value facts are just unknowable. I'm going to sort of set these views aside and mainly focus on pro and anti-theism. Okay, and then you might have noticed that in parentheses I put "for us" after each definition. I was trying to sort of simplify, but that's because there's a further distinction that's made here between what you might call like personal pro or anti-theism and impersonal pro or anti-theism. So personal pro or anti-theism would say that God's existence would be a good or bad thing for us as humans. And then impersonal pro or anti-theism would say that God's existence would be a good or bad thing for the world. So I'm focusing on the personal versions of these. I didn't put that on the handout just to try to kind of keep it simple, but I'm focusing on whether God's existence would be a good or bad thing for us. And what I want to do is apply this question to the epistemic realm. And so this is why the paper is called the epistemic axiology of theism. I want to seek to answer the question, would God's existence be an epistemically good thing for us? So there's basically two main views: that God's existence would be an epistemically good thing for us, epistemic pro-theism, and then epistemic anti-theism, that God's existence would be an epistemically bad thing for us. So, and like I said, technically I'll be focusing on epistemic personal axiology of theism, because you might be like, well, look, if we have this like omniscient being and we add that to the world, that'll add all this like knowledge and true belief. So that's like in some sense objectively epistemically good. That's not really what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about like, would it be epistemically good for us? And so just to clarify, this question is distinct from the epistemology of theism. You could say, look, it's irrational to believe in God, but God's existence is epistemically good for us. And you could also say that it's rational to believe in God, but God's existence would be epistemically bad for us. So these two views technically cross-cut each other. Although I do think these axiological questions could bear on the epistemological questions, at least if two different constraints are met. First, you think that believing in God gives you a better shot at some of these good epistemic consequences. And then two, epistemic consequentialism is true. So I actually have another paper called, it's called an epistemic version of Pascal's wager, where I try to make an argument kind of like this. But that's not my focus today. I'm just focusing on the axiological question. Okay, so what I want to do today is explore some considerations in favor of both epistemic pro-theism and epistemic anti-theism, but then ultimately argue for epistemic pro-theism. So what I'm going to do is just briefly give an overview of some of the main views of epistemic value. And then I'm going to talk about, like, really the epistemic axiology of theism hasn't been addressed that much. The only places I know where it's really been addressed are two anti-theism arguments. So two arguments that God's existence would be epistemically bad for us. So I'm going to kind of briefly summarize those and bring up some worries to them, and then explain why I think epistemic pro-theism is the way to go. I then have two objections and some outstanding questions. I probably won't have time for the objections though. So let's move for the sake of time to section 2, epistemic value. This is just a really brief overview of some of the main views of epistemic value. So as I think with, non-epistemic value theory, a lot of epistemologists distinguish between instrumental and intrinsic value. So one kind of common view is that evidentially supported beliefs are instrumentally valuable because they lead to true beliefs, but they're not necessarily good in and of themselves. So instrumental epistemic goods are good because they lead to other epistemic goods. And then there's intrinsic epistemic goods, which are goods that are good in and of themselves. A very common view of epistemic value, maybe one of the most popular, is what's called veritism. And that's the view that accuracy is the final or intrinsic epistemic value. And accuracy is normally understood in terms of gaining true beliefs and avoiding false beliefs, or gaining accurate credences and avoiding inaccurate credences. So this is like a very common model that's used in what's called epistemic utility theory, but it's also just kind of really generally popular. Like Goldman has this view, and many others. Many epistemic consequentialists have this view too. But another view of epistemic value is that it's actually not just true belief that's valuable, but actually knowledge is what's intrinsically epistemically valuable. And, this question sort of goes back to Plato, is knowledge more valuable than true belief? And if so, why? I think that's actually an important challenge for the strict veritas. So again, I'm not, and maybe I'll say this, my point here isn't to argue for a particular view of epistemic value, but I think this background will be helpful for things we're going to talk about later. So some people think knowledge is what's epistemically valuable. Some people think evidentially supported belief is actually what's epistemically valuable. And Feldman, I think the paper is called The Ethics of Belief, actually says that he thinks it's more valuable than true belief. So it's not a view that evidentially supported belief is valuable because it gets to the truth, but I think Feldman thinks it's just valuable in and of itself. And then on some views, understanding is what's epistemically valuable. So I think like Quanvig and Pritchard have this view. Some views think epistemic virtues, like exemplifying or possessing them, is that's epistemically valuable. And then another view that I think is really interesting is some people say, yeah, maybe some or some of the above is what's epistemically valuable, but it's when they contain important or significant content. So if I just go out and count the number of blades of grass on my lawn, I could gain true beliefs, evidentially supported beliefs, maybe even come to know things, but like, who cares how many blades of grass are on my lawn? So like Brian Talbot and Jane Friedman have some interesting work on like whether the content matters for epistemic value. Super interesting discussion. Again, we don't need to go into that today, but it's relevant, I think. Then there are pluralist views that say there are several final epistemic values. So I'm not planning on arguing for any of these views, but I think it's just important to kind of keep in mind for later. Okay, so briefly what I want to do is talk about, when did I start? 2:35. So, okay, I have been going for like between 5 and 10 minutes. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out time. How long? I've been going for like 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about two arguments that have been given in the literature that I think are really two of the only places that the epistemic axiology of theism has been addressed. And basically just give these arguments. And honestly, they're both pretty brief and honestly, I think kind of underdeveloped too. And so I'm going to give some worries for them, but I'm really thinking through this and reading a lot of this literature for the first time. So it's an incubator conference. Happy to get your feedback on this. And also both of these authors have names that are hard to pronounce. So I'm very sorry if I pronounce them wrong. So I think it's Matson. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. He has what I'm calling the magic argument. So he distinguishes between what he calls, the way he defines naturalism and supernaturalism. He says naturalism is the view that purposes are not fundamental. So he says on this view, human discovery could, at least in principle, be limitless. Because at bottom, things will have a mechanical explanation rather than a purposeful explanation. So he thinks if purposes are not fundamental, this kind of enables us to really inquire into and make a lot of discoveries about like the most fundamental facts. I think he's really focused on like science too. I'll talk about that when I talk about some worries. So then he talks about supernaturalism, which he takes theism to be a kind of supernaturalism. And he defines this as the view that purposes are fundamental. And he says the world in some sense contains magic. I think what he means by this is like miracles. And so he says, look, if something magical occurs, there's no way that it occurs. It's just kind of this miracle. So there's no manner that which it occurs. There's no answer to how it occurs. There's no mechanism that can explain how it occurs. We just can't scrutinize it more deeply. This is pretty much a direct quote from his paper, in case you're wondering. And he's like, look, something magical, namely God, stands at the foundation of the universe. So he thinks that these kinds of considerations are strong reasons to prefer epistemic anti-theism to epistemic pro-theism. He thinks we can do a lot more inquiry and learn a lot more about the universe if at bottom we have these mechanical explanations than if we have magic or if we have like these miracles. So that's his argument. And then Lougheed, I like Kirk and I know Kirk and I don't know how to say his name. Maybe I'll just say Kirk. Kirk has what I call the complete understanding argument. And these three premises are pretty much quoted from his book. So here's basically how it goes. Premise one, if God exists, then complete understanding is impossible. He basically motivates this in two ways. One, humans just could not ever fully understand God. One reason to think this, humans are infinite, God is finite. Another reason to think this, we couldn't fully understand God without knowing what it's like to be God. That seems pretty difficult. So we can't have complete understanding if God exists because we can't fully understand God. Second reason is if God's interfering with natural causation. I think Kirk is actually not as much into this reason. He puts a lot more weight on the first reason, but this reminds me of some of the stuff that maybe Matson was getting at too. But the thought is like, if God is constantly interfering and there's all these miracles everywhere, then this could be a problem for scientific inquiry. And I think Kirk's like, well, it depends on like how many miracles. So if there's only miracles here or there, this probably wouldn't be such a bad consequence. But it's basically these main two reasons. So we can't fully understand God, and then God might interfere with natural causation. And then he says, look, a world with complete understanding is better than a world without complete understanding. Oh, and I should also mention he's defining understanding in just the sense of whatever you think is epistemically valuable. So he's not meaning that to mean actual understanding in the technical epistemological sense. And so then he concludes that with respect to complete understanding, a world with God is worse than a world without God. Okay, here's 4 worries I have about these arguments, but again, this is like totally work in progressy, so definitely interested to hear what you guys think about these. Here's my first worry. Both of these authors seem to be very sanguine about the epistemic things like possibilities we have on atheism. And they seem to assume that atheism makes possible or even allows for some kind of complete understanding. And I'm not convinced we can be so sure of that. I just don't know why atheism would guarantee we can fully understand the world. There's actually been some really interesting challenges to atheism on this regard, like the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Maybe the verdict's not out there, but I think that's at least sort of worth throwing in the mix here. And I also don't think that Mattson's convinced me that if atheism's true, we're going to have a good mechanical explanation of everything. I mean, the quantum stuff is super weird with things kind of popping in and out of existence. So it's not at all clear that given that purposes aren't fundamental or that atheism's true, we're going to have a good mechanical explanation of like these fundamental quantum particles, just to give one example. Okay, so I'm a lot less sanguine about like atheism will just like give us all the answers or whatever. Like things are great, so epistemically great on atheism. Okay, worry number 2, this is maybe more of a worry for Mattson's argument. I don't see why these appeals to magic, which I presumably think means miracles, would mean that we can't know about or explain how something occurs. So if there is a miracle, we can explain how it occurs by appealing to God. Like God did it, right? Why is that not a good or intelligible explanation? Why is that worse than a mechanical explanation? I mean, maybe there's an answer here, but it's not clear to me that there's no explanation. We just have to like throw our hands up and we can't know anything. And furthermore, I mean, depending on like how much of maybe like a skeptical theist you are, you might think we can know some things about like God's intentions and why God works in the ways that God works. And maybe we could give a further explanation than God did it, but say something about why God did it. So I don't see why miracle means can't give any explanation. Okay, worry number 3, especially Mattson, but maybe also Kirk to an extent, seem to be super, super focused on scientific inquiry and what we could or couldn't know with science. But there's a lot of other means to know things other than just science. I think everyone here would probably agree with that. I'm preaching to the crowd, but I think especially Mattson seems to be assuming that if we can't study it with science, we're basically epistemically in the dark. And that's just false. We have philosophy, we have, all these other epistemic sources, memory and a priori knowledge. And, so I'm not saying he's like endorsing scientism. I'm just saying we need to be thinking about these other ways that we might know things other than just science. Okay, and then my final worry is like a little bit more concessive. And the thought is this: even if there are some epistemic costs to theism, I don't think either author has fully considered the relevant epistemic benefits. And then I think ultimately to decide whether we're epistemic pro-theist or epistemic anti-theist, we need to weigh all the costs and benefits. So what I want to do quickly in the next section is talk about some of those benefits. So I'm going to talk about 2 smaller considerations and then 1 bigger consideration, and then probably just be done after that. Okay, 2 smaller considerations. One is belief in God. So if theism is true, then we can truly believe, justifiably believe, and maybe even know one of the most important facts about the world in our existence. And that's that God exists. And you might wonder, how could we justifiably believe or know this? There's a lot of stories out there. One is a Plantingan story. Maybe it's not guaranteed that we could, but I think there's some good arguments that if theism is true, we could have justified belief, at least justified belief that God exists, maybe knowledge. But if theism is false, there's no such guarantee that we're going to know this really important fact about the world and our existence. So Klaas Cray actually briefly mentions that in his new book on the axiology of theism, and I thought that was worth kind of putting in there. The second thing that neither of them talk about, but I think is like really obvious, is like divine revelation, right? So if theism is true, and especially if it's a more robust, maybe sort of personal kind of theism, I think it's very likely that God is going to be in the business of revealing important truths to humanity. And so not only is this like a pretty good epistemic source, like some of the best testimony you're going to get, right? but presumably also God would reveal important truths rather than pointless truths. And revelation happens. There's a lot of different stories here, but via scriptures, via religious teachers, leaders, prophets, maybe via the natural law, maybe morality is somehow built into our minds, via on Christianity, via the incarnation. Jesus is, the image of the invisible God, and more, like maybe dreams, visions, prayer, etc., etc. So this seems like a really important epistemic source on theism, and potentially a way we could get not only epistemically valuable states, but important epistemically valuable states. And it's not at all clear that there's some kind of analog to it on atheism or naturalism. Okay, then the biggest thing that I want to push that I think is a huge consideration in favor of epistemic pro-theism has to do with afterlife considerations. So look, if God exists, it's very likely that there's an afterlife. And on most conceptions of the afterlife is very epistemically good, right? So I'll just talk about a couple examples. On Christianity, we have the beatific vision. This is the doctrine that those in heaven are face to face with God. They see God's essence, and then even on some views, they're in some way like united with that essence. But importantly, I think the beatific vision is commonly understood to have some kind of intellectual component where one sort of gains true beliefs, knowledge, or understanding about kind of God, themselves, and the world in this like super rich and almost indescribably glorious way. So that seems super, super epistemically valuable to me. And then on other religions as well, on Buddhism, there's the Enlightenment, which is something like the state of comprehending reality as it is. I'm not an expert on this, but that seems pretty epistemically valuable to me. And on Mormonism, some versions of Mormonism, you can become God or a god or godlike, and the epistemic benefits of being divine seem quite significant, right? So I think on a lot of different religions in the afterlife, there's these really significant epistemic benefits that we should be thinking about. And also in the afterlife, at least on a lot of religious traditions, we in some sense have direct access to God. We can ask God like any question about any topic we want. And this seems super epistemically valuable. On almost any of the theories of epistemic value that we talked about from section 2, we'll have like all these like true beliefs, knowledge, accurate credences, understanding, etc., etc. Another view of epistemic value is that epistemic values like derive from someone's preferences. I think it would also be very epistemically valuable there because you could kind of ask God questions about whatever you were curious or interested about. So that's super epistemically valuable as well. So yeah, like I said, these afterlife goods are very good at almost any of the notions of epistemic value we talked about. And then if theism is true, I think this might even be infinitely epistemically valuable. There's different ways of spelling this out. Like one way is that we like learn new things like every day for all infinity, on maybe a less, a more puzzling view, we gain something infinitely epistemically valuable when we're like united with God at the beatific vision. I'm not exactly sure how you would spell that out, but it's possible. And then even if you're like scared of infinities, don't want to go in for that, at the very least, it's going to be very, 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 very finitely good. And so I think it's going to outweigh, even if you think Kirk or Stephen's arguments, or there's like other, epistemic anti-theistic considerations, I think these afterlife considerations are probably going to outweigh that. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the two objections. You can look at them on your handout. Basically, the upshot of both of them is that these really hefty pro-theistic epistemic considerations are going to be outweighed, even if there are some anti-theistic considerations that I haven't considered. And then I guess some things I was interested in talking about in Q&A was, what do I need to assume specifically about the concept of God to get this off the ground? I haven't really thought about that as much, so I'd be interested to hear about that. And then if there are other either pro or anti-epistemic theistic considerations that I haven't mentioned, I think that would be really helpful too. But obviously happy to talk about whatever you all found interesting. So thanks.
All right, thanks, Liz. Okay, so if you have a question, we're gonna do a queue here. So go down to your reactions button at the bottom of your screen and you can raise your hand and then I'll get to you in order here. Two notes, just to move the discussion along. I'm gonna kind of limit follow-ups just so Liz can be exposed to as much feedback from as many of you as possible. But then if we exhaust the queue, I'll come back for follow-ups at the end if you still have one. Also, if you'd like, go ahead and introduce yourself and say where you're from when you make your comments, so we can all kind of get to know each other a little bit better. All right, so let's let Andrew Chignell start us off. So go for it, Andrew.
Okay, thanks. I'm Andrew Chignell. I'm a faculty member at Princeton. Thanks, Liz. It's a really cool paper, really interesting. I can see that at Ryerson, you're going to be the headquarters for the axiology of theism with class.
We're actually doing a conference on it later this summer. So
nice.
Anyway.
So my question is, how important it is to you that it be epistemic, or that it involves beliefs? I mean, one of the things you work on is belief, obviously. What about a picture where what's, a kind of more Kierkegaardian picture, where what's really important in this life, given our relative blindness about what's really going on, is something like faith, which for him doesn't involve belief and certainly doesn't involve knowledge. So what's really good about this life, where we see through a glass darkly, is when we take on faith, certain things. And then, okay, so we'll add the afterlife to it, but then let's take a picture where what we have in the afterlife is not belief or knowledge, but something more intimate. The German tradition calls intellectual intuition. You talked about the beatific vision. That also doesn't need to be articulated in terms of belief or knowledge. So it seems like there's a whole tradition of thinking about how it works, where we have faith now and intuition later, and none of that involves beliefs or knowledge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's like two things. So I guess the first, I hadn't thought about the Kierkegaard thing, but that is really interesting. And I guess maybe part of what this shows is that you could totally be like a, what would it be? An epistemic anti-theist. I want to make sure I get the terminology right, but like a pro-theist overall, right? So you could say, that might even be Kierkegaard's view, actually. Like you could say, look, faith is this like inherently irrational thing, but that's what's so great about it, maybe in this non-epistemic sense, right? So yeah, that's super interesting. And again, it's kind of related to the first point I was making, where I'm like, you can actually like really mix and match a lot of these views. And you're making a further point, which I think is like, you could mix and match general claims about the axiology of theism with these more specific epistemic claims as well. So so that's really interesting. That's something that is probably worth adding to the paper. The second thing, so I want to learn more about intellectual intuition, what exactly that means, but I'm very open to the possibility that that could just be added to the list of potential epistemic values. I mean, I'm curious how you think those authors would feel about that, but if that could be like just added to the list, then that could be just another way in which the afterlife is epistemically valuable. I'm very open to like non-traditional ways of understanding epistemic value, so I'm not at all tied to it having to be something about beliefs. And like arguably some of those aren't about beliefs, like having epistemic virtues that might not actually mean you have certain beliefs. It might mean you have like certain dispositions to look for evidence in certain situations, or be curious, or however you want to spell that out.
Okay, so it's epistemic in some really broad sense that doesn't necessarily involve knowledge, belief, or justification.
I'm at least open to that.
Okay.
I want to be neutral on epistemic value, but I do think, probably if you have super strong commitments on epistemic value, that could also change what you end up saying about the debate between epistemic pro and anti-theists. So there's, I guess, a choice point there.
Right, thank you.
Nice question, yeah.
All right, next we'll hear from Andrei Bukharev.
Thank you. Andrei Bukharev, Marist College. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed your paper, or at least what you presented, I should say. A quick question about the objection from hell. You mentioned that you think annihilationism is going to face a bigger problem. So I guess I would need to know more about the view of hell, because it seems like, there can be some accounts where, you've got conditional immortality and people, end up being annihilated after they've, because let's say you're a retributionist and, you've offended, God, and therefore, you get 1,000 years of being tortured by demons. So I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly what sort of an advantage we're going to have, right, if we posit an eternal hell, and furthermore, hell as understood by traditional theists, not, let's say, views like there's a view that I've defended elsewhere where you can get out and it's actually pretty decent in hell and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'm thinking here of the traditional view of hell and why on earth would we think this is going to be an epistemically good thing in any way? So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess, yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, theology involved with this, and some of it is not in my area of expertise. I think you're totally right. There's different views of hell that would be relevant to this argument. So one view of hell, I actually think it's kind of reasonable to either think that hell is epistemically good or think that hell is epistemically bad. I can really see arguments for either position. One is that hell does involve suffering in some sense, but it's still an important place of learning, maybe about yourself or about God or about other people or whatever. So I can see that view of hell. Another view of hell that I'm open to is that hell is actually just a place of confusion and epistemic badness, And so in that sense, I mean, one thing that's interesting is, I guess, comparing the epistemic values of the afterlife to how the afterlives are generally traditionally viewed. So on the traditional view, like hell would be the best, and then annihilationism, and then hell. And on this view, like the epistemic facts would parallel that. So heaven would be the best. You would get all this learning. Annihilationism would be like zero, and then hell would just be full of confusion and false beliefs. So on that, I think that view would, challenge what I'm saying more. And my basic response to this possibility, one that I wanted to think about more though, is that at least if theism is true, this afterlife learning is possible for everyone. I don't think we can know for sure that hell will be that way, and there's no afterlife learning that occurs. Like everyone's just annihilated on atheism, right? And so it still seems epistemically better if theism is true. I mean, and here's there's also so many distinctions that I could make to start off this paper with that I think things can get kind of complicated. But another possibility is that theism is epistemically good for some people and epistemically bad for others. So that's maybe something I should talk more about in the paper. If you think certain people are guaranteed to go to hell or something, then that might be sort of the view that falls out of it. But yeah, I do think views, what I was basically thinking about is views where maybe you are temporarily in some kind of bad place and then annihilated. I was just sort of counting that as annihilation. So that's sort of how I was viewing it. I don't know if that was helpful, but.
No, it was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, David Vanderland, you're next.
Okay, I'm David Vanderlaan, Westmont College. I am now unmuted. Liz, thanks for that. So I'm really with you here. I want to add a little something. So you're talking about the epistemic value of theism, mostly by listing sort of a number of different sources of knowledge, right, or of epistemic value. So in a certain sense, that's quantitative. And I want to suggest that there is also a qualitative benefit here. And all I have in mind is just the thought that, look, if there is revelation of the sort that you specify, then it seems that we've got a decent shot of knowledge of the things that are most important for us.
Yeah.
Right. And now I'm open to the thought, sort of along the lines that Andrew was suggesting, that, maybe in a certain sense, that's inferior. So if faith is knowledge, the way Calvin and others think of it, maybe it's inferior to sight, sure, but it's also super valuable for us in this life because we're learning about the things that are most important for our own flourishing and about the most valuable things that there are in reality, right? Yep. One complication there is what's the flip side. So if you're not a theist, is it even important sort of which things you learn? I'm not even sure how to assess that question, but maybe you think some things are more important than others, right?
Yeah.
So the theist has sort of a qualitative edge in addition to the quantitative one, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I like the way of putting it, quantitative versus qualitative, but I think that sort of parallels what I was thinking of when I said some people just count up the number of true beliefs, whereas some people actually think the content is really important. And maybe a true belief about whether God exists should be weighed a lot more heavily than a true belief that it's 3:10 p.m. right now or something, So yeah, I think you're totally right. But what I think is cool about this picture is I think it can actually respect that distinct, like I totally agree that it gives us the quality and the quantity, especially because with divine revelation, presumably God's going to be revealing the most important theological and moral truths to us. So yeah, I totally agree, and I like that way of putting it.
Okay, next in the queue is Alex Strasser.
Hey, I'm Alex Strasser. I'm a graduate student at Texas A&M. So my question is pretty much, what would you say to the idea that, well, we already have infinite epistemic value without God, so it doesn't benefit us? As in, the idea would be something like, we already have infinite true beliefs about like simple arithmetic or logical things like n+1, apply that to all the natural numbers. I believe that 0 + 1 is 1, 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 1 is 3, and then continue that. So I already have an infinite number of true beliefs. And so this could rely on like certain, belief sets where it includes logical commitments, or like, I don't know, one of my professors mentioned beliefs as like what you would answer if someone asked you something. And so like revealing my ignorance on what how people normally understand beliefs maybe, but and maybe like certain decision theoretic considerations like infinite utility stuff can apply to show that it would still be, because you still have it on theism too. So you can still try to show that. Anyway, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I know it's a really nice question. I mean, because it brings up two super interesting issues. I mean, the first is like what it is to believe something, and then the second is like all this stuff with infinities and counting value that I'm really interested in both. So it's a great question. So yeah, I mean, the first question, like what is it to believe something, is super interesting, and I think there are different views of that. So Robert Audi, who's my advisor at Notre Dame, he loves to distinguish between dispositional beliefs than dispositions to believe. So at least on his view, you might have an infinite number of dispositions to believe things, but that doesn't mean you have an infinite number of beliefs, even if beliefs are understood in some way dispositionally. And I do think it's sort of puzzling to think that we really could have an infinite number of beliefs, like given that our minds are finite. So you'd have to have some kind of story about how we could actually have an infinite number of beliefs. And I think some people would at least be kind of skeptical of that initially, but I totally agree with you. Like a lot of it is going to depend on what we say about belief, and I don't even have fully worked out views of all of that. But I think you would need to do a good amount of work, I think, to convince people that we actually do have an infinite number of beliefs and not just an infinite number of like dispositions to believe. But I think that said, I think you could do some fancy stuff with infinities to try to show that it could be even better on theism, because like you said, we still have all those beliefs or dispositions to believe or whatever you want to call them on theism, but arguably on theism we have a bunch of other stuff too. So you just a bunch of other true beliefs or knowledge or understanding or whatever. So you would need a way of measuring infinities that would like you could show that that's bigger or better than the first thing. And actually some of the Pascal's wager literature, I think, lends itself to different ways you might kind of measure or compare infinities here. But I think the idea is that even if you do think we have an infinite number of true mathematical beliefs or pieces of mathematical knowledge, if theism is true, you could get all that and more. At least that's kind of how I would want to try to argue. So, but great question.
Thanks.
All right, we got 4 more people in the queue and like 6-7 more minutes. So let's see how fast we can go. All right, next is Jim Sturba.
Hi, Liz. It's a very nice paper.
Thanks.
I have a question focusing on your notion of the axiology of theism. So it seems you could understand axiology of theism for our world, and then you can understand it for some possible world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you thought of it, if you made this distinction, you thought of it for our world, then if there was a really robust logical argument against the existence of God, God is logically incompatible with the evil in the world, then you couldn't have an axiology of theism for our world. Then you could still have axiology theories for possible worlds different from ours, that have all that our world has. or you could just be, you might have noticed this distinction and then just assume, well, I'm just going to assume that God is logically possible given our world, and so even given the evil in the world, and so I'm not even going to take this up. But if you thought there was this logically impossible argument given evil in the world for our world, then there couldn't be, I think, an axiology of theism for our world.
Is the thought that that's because evil is somehow logically incompatible with God, and so a world with our amount of evil would just
a God
it would be an impossible world to add God to our world. Is that your thought?
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not convinced that our world is logically incompatible with God's existence. I mean, I definitely, look, I take the problem of evil very seriously. I think it's one of the most serious problems for traditional theism, absolutely. But I'm not convinced that it there's a logical, like, it's a contradiction, I guess, to say that there's, you know, a certain amount of evil and there's an all-powerful, all-good God. So so yeah, but I mean, I guess another thing that some people will do is they'll think about nearby possible worlds. So maybe, you know, if you were really saying we can't have an axiology of theism in our world, I think this is what Class does in his book. He also considers like nearby possible worlds. So maybe you could consider them that were under some threshold of evil and think about the question that way.
Okay.
But thanks for your question and nice to see you.
Yes.
Daniel Rubio, you're next.
All right, cool, thanks. Very interesting topic. So I was just gonna bring up one consideration that I thought might be interesting to think about in this context. So there's this paradox, sometimes known as the Church-Fitch paradox. The interesting proof is that if everything is knowable, then everything is known. Obviously, you can make that a biconditional, but the other direction is trivial. And that's often been taken to show that you've either got to go for unknowable truths or an omniscient agent. And like plausibly unknowable truths, it's the presence of unknowable truths, the existence of unknowable truths is epistemically bad because like I want to know those.
Yeah.
And so this could be made into a point for epistemic pro-theism. There will be no unknowable truths. And furthermore, like if your God is at least a little bit nice, they might not just hoard all the truths, and then you might get to know the truths that would be otherwise unknowable. So that's just one consideration you might think about on the pro-theism side of the ledger.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've heard of that paradox, but I hadn't thought of the relevance here. So that's great. I wrote that down, and yeah, I'll very likely be adding that to the paper. So thanks, Daniel. That's awesome. Very helpful.
All right, Wade Monroe, you're up.
Thank you. So with respect to your small considerations in belief in God, I wonder if there's just a kind of unbreakable symmetry here in that, let's say for a world in which God exists, the fact that God exists is incredibly important in that world. And presumably for a world in which God does not exist, the fact that God does not exist is equally as important in that world. And so if God doesn't exist, well, we can truly believe it. And that's going to have just as much epistemic value as a world in which God did exist, and we truly believed that. Right? So there's always going to be a symmetry such that insofar as we have these extremely important facts that we could come to truly believe or justify believe or know if God exists, then the fact that those facts don't hold in a world in which God doesn't exist would be equally valuable. So there's no way to break that symmetry.
Nice. No, I like that a lot. I hadn't thought about that. I like that. I mean, maybe, so you actually kind of talked a little about this yesterday, like the planting in epistemology. And I guess, I mean, and I'm not like a super big, like planting as epistemologies, right? I'm not like a, you know, I'm a reformed epistemologist in like the very thin sense that I think you could be rational to believe in God without an argument, but I don't know if I go in for the whole, you know, Plantinga has a lot of other stuff that he goes in for that I don't know if I want to go in for, but I think it would be interesting. And actually Andrew Moon, I think, has a paper that recently came out in Phil Studies where he tries to argue there's some kind of like asymmetry between theism and atheism, where if theism is true, we can have knowledge or justified beliefs about God in a way that isn't as guaranteed if atheism is true. And that's because of a design plan and a lot of other things that maybe, again, bring in this Plantingian baggage that I'm not totally sure that I want to go in for, but that might be one possible way to break the asymmetry. But yeah, I think that's a really nice point. Another interesting thing to think about too is like, well, if God exists, then knowing that God exists or truly believing that God exists or whatever seems super important. if God doesn't exist, is knowing that God doesn't exist as important? I mean, maybe, I don't know. Something I would want to think more about. But yeah, point taken for sure.
Thank you.
All right. I guess we're technically at time here, although John, if you had a quick comment, do you want to get it in? Good.
Oh, I want to hear it, but okay. It's okay.
Well, we have email and other ways to correspond. But anyway, let's thank our speaker, Liz.
Thanks for your feedback. It was extremely helpful. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to the organizers.
Hey, Liz, I don't know if this is going to get closed, but if not, I mean, I guess
I'll keep it open.
just for a couple minutes. But anyhow, I was just trying to think about, I mean, in response to, I think, another question, you said you might want to relativize the epistemic value to individuals. And I guess for reasons you know about, I mean, I'd be sympathetic with that. But I guess I was just sort of trying to figure out how the debate even looks once you do that. I mean, then there's like all the atheists, it's epistemically disvaluable if God exists because their belief, they've got a false belief. And I don't know. I just didn't know.
Yeah.
It just seems like it would make things weird. And then you might still be interested in this kind of more global question, like, well, would it be good or bad overall if we aggregate the value and disvalue?
Yeah.
That'll be held hostage to like what percentage of people are atheists and gonna go to hell or whatever, whatever the things that generate disvalue. And anyhow, I don't know if you thought about that stuff at all.
No, that's nice. A really flat-footed response is like, there's more theists in the world than atheists, so that seems more valuable. But it would also be weird if like this ended up kind of turning on like how many people were actually theists. So
right.
So that's a good point. And I do think I agree with you. Like something seems kind of lost if you just relativize it to individuals, that maybe, I don't know if it like maybe makes it less interesting or something, but I haven't thought a ton about this, but
it just gets weird either way for me, even because then it's like with the understanding argument. I mean, complete understanding is impossible if God exists. I mean, I guess like, okay, fine, let's say I grant that, but I mean, are we talking about what's possible for like any inquiring being? I mean, it seems like there's just these weird issues about like, okay, if God exists, there's this fundamental mystery in some sense is the idea behind some of these objections. But like, okay, but other people, I don't know, most people maybe aren't even interested in that, thinking about that. I mean, are we making like some actual comparative claim, like, given the world as it actually is, there would be less epistemic value if God exists or doesn't exist? Or is it some sort of potential claim like, we're doomed to frustration at the end of time, something like that, which seems like a pretty different kind of a concern.
No,
anyway.
That's good. It could be worth talking about different measures of epistemic value, and like, are we talking like expected epistemic value, or like how are we measuring, and then are we just adding it up?
Exactly.
Are we looking at average? I mean, a lot of this gets into actually just like some of the familiar puzzles in like population ethics and all that, and ethics. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be explored here, but yeah, this is helpful. I was like taking notes as you're talking. So
awesome.
Thanks.
Anyhow, great talk, Liz.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk too, by the way.
Thank you. Whatever.
Yeah.
That's good. All right.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks again for sharing, Jeff.
Yeah, it's super cool talk. I look forward to reading the paper, whenever it comes out, or even if it's not a paper. This was worth it. This was a fun session.
Oh, thanks. I just realized there's still 11 people here. People are like popping out. Andrew, I gave you a shout out. Did you hear that? Oh, you're muted. We can't hear your voice.
Unfortunately, I do need to close the room now so we can start the next round of session.
Okay. I gave your Phil Studies paper a shout out, Andrew. Hi, Bob. Thanks for coming.